So today we're going to be building on the overview that I recorded in the last video, and we're actually going to set up our React Native and Redux application. So first of all, we're going to set up React Native, then we're going to look at how we can import some packages, namely Redux, and I'll talk a little bit about the folder structure that we're going to be putting in place, and we're going to make it dance. In other words, we're going to make sure that the application does in fact run, and that we haven't broken anything and we're not in some sort of red screen of death situation. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do when you're working with React Native is actually go visit the React Native Getting Started page on github.io. You can just Google this, just search Getting Started React Native, and you'll probably find yourself on this page. There's instructions for iOS and Android, Mac, Linux, and Windows. In terms of development environments and mobile environments. In my case, I'm going to be working with the Mac, and I'm going to be working on iOS. So I've already done brew install node, I've already done brew install watchman, and I've already installed the React Native command line interface. So these are the three commands that you're probably going to want to make sure are functioning correctly in your project, or for your project, I should say. The next step is, well, in my case, like I said, the name of the project is Peckish. In fact, I'm just going to remove this directory and we'll stick with the React Native naming convention of using title case. So I'm going to say React Native init, and I'm just going to call this Peckish. Great. So it looks like everything seems to be in order. It looks like it was able to install correctly. This is a good sign. It's also imported React version 15.2.1. And now if I go to the Peckish folder and I take a look at what's there, I should see a few folders and a few files. I'm just going to open this in my Finder so that we can talk a little bit more about it. So if you look here, you'll notice that we've got a number of different folders. We've got the Android folder, which we're going to discount, at least for the purposes of this tutorial. Then we've got index.ios.js and index.android.js. This is a naming convention that you'll see in React Native. And React Native is intelligent enough to use the correct corresponding JS file for individual components. So the way that React works very quickly is that you have a bunch of components. Each component is described in a JS or a JSX file typically. And so if you are calling native code, you might want to have a variation for Android and a variation for iOS. The iOS folder is where the Peckish files live. This is where your typical Xcode project would live. And then the node modules, if you're coming from any kind of NPM or Node or ES6 development experience, this should look relatively familiar, which is basically this is where all of the vendor libraries, the third-party libraries, live. And then you've got package.json, which is your manifest, which describes what the dependencies of your application are. So for our purposes, I'm just going to go to the iOS folder. It's also worth mentioning that I have Xcode installed, and that's working on my machine. And that, of course, is a dependency for making sure that you can do this properly. Now, when I open this, I should see that I have Peckish. I should see a relatively straightforward application. And the app delegate folder, or the app delegate file rather, is kind of the entry point into this application. In some cases, you'll want to make modifications to this file, but for now, everything should be fine. And just to make sure that everything is working, I should be able to pick a device and hit play. Now you'll notice that Node starts to run, and if everything works, and it should work because I haven't actually written any code yet, the runtime, the Node package manager, is going to essentially compile all the JavaScript, and then that becomes a build step in the overall iOS packaging process. Now I'm just going to change my scale here so that this works. All right. Maybe I can bring that up to 75%. That's close enough. And you can see that part of it was compiled, And then shortly thereafter, you can see that there was this transformation step, and boom, there you have it. Now we're running, we have React Native. Everything seems to be okay so far. So the next step is just to poke around a little bit. Now, you probably noticed that I'm working on the command line. You don't have to. It's not necessary. Unfortunately, I was indoctrinated in the school of Vim, and so I now live in the land of Vim and VI. I am not saying that you should or have to. It just works for me. And so forgive me if you're an Emacs developer or you're using something else. I'm sure it's better. I'm just stuck with this now. Anyways, if we take a look at the overall application, if we go to the index.ios.js file, we can see here that we've got essentially some view components. These are described using JSX, which kind of looks like XML. And we've got some preliminary styles. We've got welcome to React Native to get started, edit index.ios.js, and a bit more instructions over here. And if we look at the top here, we've got some comments, which for now I'm just going to delete. We can talk about that in another video maybe. And we can see that we are importing from React, and we are importing a few components from React Native. And then we've got a standard ES6 class, some styles that are described using JavaScript, and then this app register component line over here, which basically bootstraps the application. So if I go back here, you'll notice that there's some instructions telling me that I can reload the application. And this is really neat because coming from an iOS development experience where you have to recompile the application every time, with React Native, you can actually just rerun or refresh the JavaScript runtime without having to recompile everything. In some cases you do, obviously if you're changing Objective-C or Swift code, but if you're just working on the view layer, and a lot of the work in any kind of application tends to be in the view layer, you just have to hit Command-R. Now, you can also invoke the shake, which if you do Control-Command-Z, it becomes one of the options. You've got a performance monitor, an inspector. All of these things come in handy, but I'm going to look at the JS remote debugging, which you can see here, and then you can actually open the JavaScript console onto the left or to the right. So if you're a web developer, this will look very, very familiar. So now when I hit Command-R, I can see that the console is cleared, and I've got some parameters here. Now, as a JavaScript developer, sometimes you end up debugging the null program. Basically, you code your way through a function with some consoles, logs, or some other kinds of hacky bits here and there. And what's kind of neat about working with React Native is if this is part of your workflow, you can do the same thing. So if I put a hello world here as console.log, and I refresh this, I will see hello world over here. So to recap, all we've written is hello world, and we see it in our console. We have our simulator running, and it seems to be running okay. We should be able to make some changes to our application, so I'm just going to delete some of these text blocks and refresh it. And lo and behold, those changes are also appearing here. So far so good. That was step one. Step two is taking a look at our overall architecture and getting Redux installed in our application. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my project folder. And like I mentioned at the top of this video, if you're familiar with working with NPM or Node, the idea of having packages that you import from a central repository is probably something you've already done before. If we take a look at the package.json file, this is something that is not specific to React, but it's specific to the Node.js ecosystem. You can see that there are a series of dependencies that are described down here. So in our case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some dependencies. Presently, we just have React and we have React Native, and these are the version numbers. Of course, these version numbers might change, and they probably will change by the time you watch this video, but hopefully the concepts are the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an npm install save, and I'm going to add React Redux. And you will notice that there is a pile of stuff that gets brought in, namely Lodash, because Lodash is amazing. And it also is telling me that there's an unmet peer dependency, so we should probably meet that. So we're going to also bring in Redux. And then we're going to bring in two more dependencies, and these are two things that we're going to be using later on in this project, but I find them immensely valuable. One is a logging library, so we're going to add the Redux logger. And then the last thing we're going to be bringing in, and this is connected to the asynchronous component, or the part of the demo that you saw where I was able to fetch from the Spoonacular API. In our case, we're going to also grab Redux Thunk. And Redux Thunk is a library that lets you essentially make asynchronous calls and return a promise, a JavaScript promise, and then you've got the promise syntax, so you can do .then, and you have your callback, and it provides a nice, elegant, and easy-to-use interface for dealing with asynchronous requests. So I'm just going to close this, open it again, and we should see that we now have a series of dependencies that are described here. We've got React, React Native, React Redux, which serves as a bridge, Redux, Redux Logger, and Redux Thunk. Now, because we have all these new dependencies, I'm going to hit Control-C on the actual React packager, which is going to kill that. And then I'm actually just going to run it from the command line here, because I'm already working in the command line, and it keeps everything nice and clean and close to home. So I'm going to say npm start react-native. And that will essentially fire off the same command on port 8081. And now I can hit play again. And everything should work like it did before, which is a good sign. Now, in this video, I'm just going to validate that, in fact, those dependencies are loading correctly. We're not going to jump into the actual configuration of React Native at this point with Redux. So for now, I'm just going to import some of these things, and we'll play with them a little later. We'll play with them in a following video. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import a provider class, and this is coming from React Redux. We're going to be using this when we essentially bootstrap our application. And I'm going to import a method called createStore, or I should say a function, another one called applyMiddleware, another one called combine_reducers, and another one called compose. Don't worry, we will talk about this. And then I'm also going to import the Thunk middleware from Redux Thunk. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to import a method called createLogger from Redux Logger. Now, what's neat here is that this is all JavaScript, right? There's nothing here that is React Native specific. And what's really compelling about the React Native platform, like I mentioned before, is that you can essentially call JavaScript code from any NPM library, work with that code, and have it run on the virtual machine or the JavaScript runtime of the mobile operating system. So if I hit save, and then I refresh in the simulator, a good sign would be that everything continues to function. And it does. So I am very, very happy right now. So in the next video, we're actually going to go in and start to configure the overall pattern of the application. And this is run a little long, so I think I'm going to stop here, and then I'll go into the folder structure and how we can build out a very simple Redux architecture. Thanks for listening.